Hey, welcome back to Truth 316. I'm Thad, and I'm going to be speaking toward this discussion on the new heavens and the new earth. We've been looking at Revelation 20 and the foundation of Christ's kingdom here on earth. And we've talked about this through several episodes as we've been looking to how Christ is handling his kingdom. And not only that, but how the foundation of Christ's judgment upon first century Israel, that is Jerusalem, where he proclaims early in his ministry and then finally brings down in judgment the temple, which was this place of false worship. But before we begin our discussion on the new heavens and the new earth, I really wanted to go and speak a little bit more on Revelation 20 and Christ's kingdom, because we need to have a better foundation of how we're going to handle this book as we are using Old Testament scriptures to help us interpret certain passages. It's just so heavily laden with Old Testament passages and references and allusions that we would be remiss not to study more on this before we go into the new heavens and the new earth. So this long period of the millennial kingdom is the age of Christ's kingdom as he rules from heaven, and we, the church, are his priests of the kingdom. We're both priests and ambassadors of his gospel message. And we have, in this book of Revelation, although we've been speaking primarily of Revelation 20, we've also talked about what it looks like as Christ goes through his judgment period during that generation after his ascension, and the judgment that took place on first century Jerusalem where the temple came down. And so we've spent a lot of time speaking on that as well. Now, Revelation 20 does have this long history of from when Christ put Satan under his feet by throwing him into the abyss, so to speak, where Christ rules and judges death, and he is raised to the grave, and we have the binding of Satan that takes place in his first advent. But the book of Revelation, really from chapters 6 through 19, is focused primarily on the 40-year period after Christ's ascension. So that's that generation that Christ speaks of in the Olivet Discourse, and we're going to get into some of that. I've been wrestling through some of this myself, but it is my current interpretation that this generation is that same generation that experiences the bulk of the prophecies of Revelation chapters 6 through 19, as I just said. So let's examine some more of those, if you will. So here's our timeline that we've been working with. And we have to understand that Revelation is both a prophecy and a gospel. So the prophecy is primarily the description of a day of the Lord. We hear throughout and read of in the Old Testament the day of the Lord. And many of us have heard the concept of the day of the Lord, and we're looking forward to the final judgment or the final day of the Lord. But so many of these days of the Lord is not about the very last day, but days of the Lord. And this one that we're going to be speaking of here that took place in 70 AD is a particular day of the Lord that was spoken of by many of the Old Testament prophets, and is a day of judgment upon apostate Israel. So the timing of that day is according to the opening of the book in chapter 1, which is these things are going to happen soon. So in Revelation 1, verses 1 through 3, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his slaves the things which must soon happen. And he indicated this by sending it through his angel to his slave John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the witness of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and keep the things which are written in it, for the time is near." So we covered this in a prior episode, but together, these two descriptions of things which must happen soon and for the time is near are descriptions that align with the Olivet Discourse, for example, in Matthew 23 and 24, 25. And Jesus' message to those who are standing there is that judgment is coming. And he says these things are going to take place within this generation. And so we are going to continue to look at that. Matthew 24:34 says, "Truly I say to you that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." And this generation, we have said, is speaking to the generation that he was talking to. And we can lay some foundation of that. It's not this generation of which when this takes place sometime down the road, because there's too many elements of it that come to pass in those first 40 years after Christ's ascension. So the generation speaks to the era of those that Jesus had been speaking to and is speaking to. All these things that he says here can only be referring to the categories at the beginning of chapter 24. Now, there's so many references to this kingdom age. There's some categories that extend beyond this generation, of course, and that's okay because we live in this realm of the already not yet, where the gospel message is not only for that first generation, but it goes out to all the nations. And so you'll see overlays of that. But the primary judgments that are taking place is going to take place upon that first generation. Okay, so I'm not being contradictory in this statement, but the answer is let's take a little deeper look at these things. So Matthew 24:1 and 2, and it says, "And coming out of the temple, Jesus was going along, and his disciples came up to the point of out of the temple buildings. I'm sorry, and his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down.'" Now, historians all agree that what Jesus is referring to is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So we know that this reference here is only about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD in that first generation. So not one stone here is undisputably talking about the temple's destruction. So history would prove that out. In verse 3, it says, "Now as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?'" So there's three questions that are being asked here. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So the second two and third question there are kind of combined of the sign of your coming and the end of the age. What do these look like? But when will these things happen? That's what we're getting to. The when question is essentially answered by Jesus in the next passage here later on. It says, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken." So verse 29 here is consistent with what? Well, its use here is the Old Testament. You know, he's utilizing passages from the Old Testament, from Isaiah and Joel and such, but are speaking of fulfillments of the days of the Lord that the prophets were speaking toward. So these days are of impending judgment upon disobedient Israel. Israel had been disobedient many times throughout their history, where they kept going and serving the false gods, the foreign gods, and were disobedient to the Lord Yahweh. And what else did they do? Well, they played the harlot, for one, because they were to be in covenant relationship with the Lord, but they also killed the prophets. They didn't like what they said a lot of times, and so they killed them. So let's examine just one of these references here in Joel. And it says, "And I will put wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord. So you can see here, these references are very similar to what Jesus was speaking of here back in Matthew. The sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall. And so many times the mistakes have been made that when Joel, for example, here is speaking of this type of judgment, this particular day of the Lord, too many mistakes have been made in pushing this out towards his final appearing, the judgment that is to come. When this passage is speaking towards a time that would be fulfilled and is spoken of, that Jesus was just pointing to here in the first century. So let's just take a look. So here's Joel 30, or I'm sorry, chapter 2, 30 to 32. Let's look at just these previous verses. I think we've done some of this, but just wrapping it back all the way around. So the previous verses, Joel 2, 28 through 29, and afterward, and it will be afterwards that I will pour out my spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on the male slaves and female slaves, I will in those days pour out my spirit. So, okay, this passage is proclaimed and fulfilled when? At Pentecost. The Apostle Peter points to this exact passage and said, today, this is what is fulfilled. This is what's happening at Pentecost. And so we know that if Peter is saying that this is the fulfillment at Pentecost, that it has to be speaking of that exact era. Okay, so there's so many other places that we could go that speak similarly, but let's just stick with this Joel passage for a minute. So Peter states this at Pentecost, and then right after that comes 30 to 32, and what does it say? And I will put... So first is the Pentecost, and then it says, and then I will put wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon to blood, just as we've already read. Joel is stating what is to take place at some time after Pentecost. And surely it would be within a generation. The day of the Lord was to come upon Jerusalem within that generation. And it's a type of judgment that takes place. This is symbolic language. None of these things literally happen, but is judgment language, just as it was in the Old Testament times when days of the Lord came on, like the northern tribes, for example. And this same type of judgments were spoken of by Joel. Actually, if we go all the way back to the earlier passage of Joel in chapter 1, we see, like locusts, the Assyrian army is gonna come in. And he's going to, this kingdom of Assyria is going to exile the northern kingdom and send them off and assimilate them into other nations. They're going to lose their identity as Israelites as far as the world is concerned. So this is speaking about judgment on apostate Israel. Okay, those apostate is people, Israel here, who are supposed to be in the graces of the Lord, but they turn their back and they go a different way. They apostatize from the truth. So in the first century, the apostate Israelites are those who denied the Messiah and gave their allegiance to Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. And they wanted to continue temple worship and sacrifice even after the final sacrifice had been paid. And so God will not stand for it, and he will bring judgment. And it takes time. God doesn't work things every second. Otherwise, we would have been finished, after the first bite of the fruit was taken in the garden. The pending judgment, of course, if they bit that or took that forbidden fruit, was death. And that was spiritually instantaneously, but physically, the physical death would come much later. So they continued temple sacrifice after Jesus had paid that final sacrifice as the Lamb of God. And now judgment is going to come upon Jerusalem and upon this temple, which is vacant of the Lord's presence. But for the gospel's sake, many would be saved. Look at this in verse 32. And it will be that everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh will be delivered, for on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as Yahweh has said, even among the survivors whom Yahweh calls. Sounds like a gospel message to me. How about you? Do you think this sounds like the gospel message? Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So, but this is, but look, this is speaking of a time that's on the heels after pending judgment. Okay, so do we have support of this very thing? Yeah, and in the very next verses here, we go to Joel 3, verses 1 and 2, which is the immediate passage right after what we just read. And it says, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land." So we talked about Israel being scattered among the nations. That took place, of course, with the attack from Assyria. And also we have the Babylonian captivity, where we have, after the 70 years, all the people of Judah did not go back, right? They also went out and became part of the diaspora, the dispersion of Jews into the other nations as well. But look what God's saying here, that in those days and at that time, he's going to restore the fortunes. But it's not, it is Judah and Jerusalem. But what does it say? I will gather all the nations. It almost sounds like what Jesus was saying. The gospel is going to go forth first to Jerusalem, Judea. Samaria is not here, but to all the other nations as well, right? I'm going to gather all the nations. That's what this is speaking of. So after Pentecost and after the temple comes down, this is what's going to be accomplished. You can see this is sequential according to what Joel had been writing. In those days, I will gather all the nations. And so it sounds like the gospel is going forth, right? All those nations. And also at this time, Israel, who was once divorced, is going to be restored. So that comes into play. That's something that we've been speaking of here at Cornerstone Church with Pastor Matt Grimm and Pastor Chris Winans, as we see how those who are scattered to the nations would be fulfilled at the end of the age of the Gentiles, as all the nations are being come back. There is no more there's no more separation, because the dividing wall has come down between the Jew and the Gentile, right? Between the Israelite and the Gentile, that dividing wall has come down, Jesus said. So all of Israel is not of Israel. It's not about a bloodline anymore. It's about grace. So again, this passage, on behalf of my people, my inheritance, Israel, who have been scattered among the nations, but he's gathering all the nations there in verse 2. This sounds a lot like what we were just reading in Matthew, doesn't it? But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. So what Joel had been speaking of in judgment is what the Lord is speaking of, about what it's going to look like when this time comes. This is a judgment that's coming. So this is a day of the Lord, and it's going to come upon this same group of apostates that crucified their Lord and then stayed in allegiance with Rome all the way up until the Jewish revolt against Rome. And that whole thing ends up in the coming down of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, and then what? And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, this part of the passage, verse 31 here, is not speaking of the rapture and or the final resurrection. That's not what this is. It sounds like it could be, and a lot of people have taken it as such, but that's not what this is saying. Because what happened in the descriptions from the other passages, it just says that he's going to gather all nations unto himself. And where does he gather them from? Well, the elect is gathered from the four winds. That's like north, east, you know, west and south, and from one end of the sky to the other. So all the nations are going to come to him, and this is going to take place over time. So this is what the gospel message looks like after Jerusalem comes down. The gospel goes forth. So this is the same gathering that Joel was speaking of, people from every nation, from Joel verse 3:2. So the age of the kingdom, inaugurated at his first coming and established when he took his throne at a session. So when he rises from the grave, then he's here for 40 days, and then he ascends. That's the ascension, and then he takes his throne. He is this is called his session, and now the age after the of this whole period of time is I'm sorry, after Christ ascends, there's this age of overlap, if you will, until the rest of the old covenant stuff that's going on, that, Jerusalem and the Pharisees and the priests were still practicing through that period of time. It gets abolished, right? And how is it finally abolished? When Christ takes away every portion of what they hold dear to them in where Yahweh was to be in that tabernacle, and he's no longer there because Christ now tabernacles within his people, and the temple, the place for sacrifice, is torn down. So, but there was that overlap of time. So the kingdom is in order when Christ first takes his throne, but there is this overlap of the ages until that time where the temple comes down. So now then there's no longer any place for them to do their false sacrifices. So then after that old covenant sacrifice system is totally taken away, right? The kingdom then is being populated until the age that we are in, this church age, is complete. So here we are back on our timeline, and the destruction of the temple that takes place in 70 AD is the day of the Lord that Joel was referring to, and many of the other prophets. So that day of the Lord was speaking about the judgment that was going to come and be fulfilled as Christ was dispensing his proclamation of these events that would take place in that generation to those people that he was speaking with. So 70 AD is a day of the Lord, okay, spoken of by Joel and many other of the prophets. So let's take a look at this here in 70 AD. I changed that now. It says it's the day of the Lord, according to Joel 3:14. So this day of the Lord is what puts the gathering of the nations into full swing, right? This is the era of the first resurrection. So Christ's kingdom, if you remember Revelation 20, it says, blessed are those who partake in the first resurrection. That was the spiritual resurrection. This is the born again process. This is when the Spirit comes. So this is the remnant who are born of the Spirit throughout the kingdom age. And so this is what I was speaking of. It does extend through the entire age, but a lot of the judgments that we read about and in fact, almost all of them in chapters Revelation 6 through 19 are speaking upon that generation, that era of first century after Christ, right? So, so now what about the new heavens and the new earth? We haven't really gotten to that point yet, but let's just read this verse here for a second. Revelation 21, 1 through 2. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first earth and the first heaven, and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. Well, I think we've ran over. I don't want to make these too long, so I'm going to save this description of the new heavens and the new earth to next time. But again, this foundation of how we are handling the book of Revelation and its descriptions, and the New Testament that is pulling in these very similar Old Testament prophetic passages speaking of certain times, is really important for us to gather together all the ammunition that we can partake in, so we have the best harmony. And as we think about that new heavens and the new earth, we also have to be consistent with how we're handling that symbolic information. And we should be also relying on Old Testament passages that speak to the same thing. So now, if you struggled with following this particular lesson today, as we were talking about the fulfillment of the day of the Lord, as was spoken of by Joel, and when Jesus was talking about the judgments that are going to take place upon this generation from the Olivet Discourse, just go back and listen to it again. But you have to really do your own homework on this stuff. It's the only way that we'll ever really understand this better is after hearing these things, that once we're taught, is to go in and wrestle with the text ourselves. I mean, you can hear all the mathematical equations that you want to and kind of follow along with it, but until you do a lot of different practice questions on your own and wrestle through them, you're not going to really have a good hold of how that math works. So we have to practice every day, and so that includes practicing Bible study and gathering together the harmony of the scriptures from the Old Testament and the New Testament. So next time we're going to take a look at 21 and the new heavens and the new earth. And I appreciate you sticking with me through this. This stuff is it's difficult, especially when you have a different viewpoint that you think that you understand so well, and these ideas that are being presented are combating against you and messing with what you believe to be already true. I've had to wrestle through a lot of this myself. I still don't claim to have all the truth, and I'm more than willing to change as the evidence comes in. But again, the more that we harmonize the scripture and the more consistent that we are, the better we're going to be. So, okay, well, have yourself a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time as we talk about, and we really will, the new heavens and the new earth. Good night.